They said I'd given up after home. They said the kick that dropped me was the end of my name, the end of my fight, the end of everything I had built. I remember the silence after the fall. Thousands of voices, once screaming for me, now turned into whispers of mockery. Reporters wrote my obituary while I was still breathing. Fans abandoned me like I had never existed. And maybe for a moment, I believed them. But what happened next? Wasn't the ending they expected. It was the beginning of something darker, louder, and unforgettable. They said I was gone after home. One kick, one fall, and the world decided my story was over. But if life has taught me anything, it's that endings are rarely what they seem. Sometimes, the darkest moment, the one where you can barely breathe, is the very place where something greater is born. I grew up fighting battles long before I ever stepped into a cage. I fought against silence when I couldn't speak as a child. I fought against grief when I lost my father. I fought against doubt when people looked at me and said a woman could never stand among the greatest fighters in the world. And each time, I carried those wounds with me, turning them into weapons. When Holm's kick dropped me, it wasn't just a defeat in the octagon. It was humiliation on a global stage. The headlines buried me, the fans turned their backs, and the laughter was louder than any cheer I had ever heard. That kind of fall doesn't just bruise your face, it crushes your soul. But here's the truth. Sometimes the weight that tries to break you is the same weight that makes you unbreakable. This story isn't just about me. It's about what happens when the world decides you're finished, and you refuse to let their judgment write your final chapter. It's about every person who has been mocked, written off, or told they don't belong. If you've ever felt like life counted you out, this journey will show you what it means to stand again when no one expects it. Because here, inside this story, you'll see that the power of resilience isn't in never falling, it's in rising from the ground when the whole world is watching. And before we dive in, I want you to be part of this fight. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and most importantly, drop a comment telling me which country and city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story of pain, strength, and rebirth can travel. Because maybe, just maybe, your own story begins here, too. They said I would never have a voice. They said the world would pass me by, because a girl who couldn't speak would never be heard. And maybe, in those first years, I believed them. My earliest memories aren't of laughter or playground games, they are of silence. Heavy and suffocating, a silence that trapped me inside my own mind. I was born into a world where my body worked, but my words did not. While other children screamed, cried, and demanded attention, I sat with sounds caught in my throat, trapped like prisoners begging for release. My mother tried to encourage me, but the world outside was less forgiving. Kids laughed at me, teachers avoided my eyes, and neighbors whispered that something was wrong with me. They didn't see the fire I felt building inside. They only saw a broken little girl. The silence was crueler than any opponent I would ever face. It stripped me of belonging, leaving me on the edges of every room. I remember watching my classmates chatter endlessly, their words flowing like rivers, while I stumbled over syllables that refused to form. My tongue betrayed me, and every failed attempt to speak was like another cut across my pride. She never catch up, I overheard once, a casual dismissal from an adult who didn't know how deeply words can wound. But the truth about silence is that it teaches you to listen, and I listened to everything, every laugh, every insult, every whisper behind my back. I carried those sounds like weights strapped to my body. I didn't know it then, but those weights were shaping me into something stronger. At home, my world was different. My mother, Aunt Maria, was no ordinary parent. She was a fighter, a champion who had carved her own name into the history of judo. When the world mocked my silence, she taught me another language, the language of movement, the language of discipline, the language of combat. On the mats, I didn't need words. My body spoke louder than any voice could. Every throw, every grip, every fall was a sentence written in sweat and pain. And so, while the world said I would be forgotten, I was learning to carve my story in silence. I didn't need to shout. My time would come, and when it did, my voice would be heard, not through words but through action. They thought my silence was weakness. But silence can be the sharpest blade. As I grew, the silence shaped my mind. I studied the eyes of people, the tilt of their shoulders, the curl of their lips. Where others relied on words, I learned to read intention before it was spoken. That skill would one day save me in the cage, where a single blink of hesitation could mean victory or defeat. But back then, it only deepened my loneliness. Children don't admire silence, they attack it. I remember one afternoon at school when a boy leaned across the table and mocked me, mimicking the stutter that sometimes spilled from my mouth. The room filled with laughter. My face burned, but I stayed still, my fists clenched under the desk. I wanted to scream back, to crush his words with my own. But nothing came out. Just silence, heavy and humiliating. That day I learned a lesson I would never forget. Sometimes the world won't give you a voice, you have to take one. It wasn't courage yet, it wasn't strength yet, but it was a spark. A spark that whispered, "Wait until they see what I can do." They laughed at the silence. But silence was only the beginning. At home, the spark grew into flame. My mother pushed me onto the mats, demanding discipline when the world offered pity. She didn't treat me like I was fragile, she treated me like I was capable. Every fall onto the mat knocked the breath from my lungs, but also knocked the fear from my heart. Slowly, I began to understand. The silence wasn't a curse. It was a forge. I started to crave the sound of the mat beneath me, the rhythm of drills, the crash of bodies. For the first time, I felt free. On the mats, no one asked me to speak. No one mocked me. My actions told the story. And the story was this. I was a fighter, even before I knew it. And yet, the world outside hadn't changed. They still whispered, still laughed, still doubted. But inside, I was changing. Every insult added fuel. Every whisper became a challenge. They didn't know it yet, but the girl they ignored was learning to fight in silence, preparing to unleash a voice that would echo louder than any words. Because silence doesn't last forever, and when it breaks, the sound is unforgettable. They thought silence defined me. But silence was just the start of the storm. They said loss would break me. They said a child couldn't carry grief that heavy. Maybe they were right for a while. Because when my father left this world, he didn't just leave me behind. He left a silence deeper than the one I already knew. I was 8 years old when death came for him. My father had battled his own demons for years, demons I couldn't understand at that age. I only knew the warmth of his arms, the sound of his laughter when he tossed me into the air, the way he looked at me like I was stronger than I believed. Then, one day, he was gone. Just like that. The details didn't make sense back then. Suicide is a word too sharp for a child to grasp. All I knew was that one morning my world was intact, and by nightfall it had shattered into pieces too jagged to hold. Grief is heavy, but for a child it feels like drowning. I remember lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for his footsteps in the hallway, the sound that never came. The silence mocked me, more painful than any laughter at school. My voice had already been stolen by circumstance. Now my anchor was stolen by death. My mother was stronger than anyone I had ever known. She didn't let me crumble. She told me stories of my father's love, his pride, his belief in me. But behind her strength, I could see the cracks. The exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled after long days, the way she forced a smile when she wanted to scream. And yet, grief didn't just weigh me down. It carved me. It turned my silence into resolve. I remember thinking, even at that young age, if my father couldn't fight his demons, then I will fight mine. For him. For us. They thought grief would bury me, but grief was already shaping the fighter I would become. School didn't get easier. In fact, it became crueler. Kids have a way of smelling weakness, and mine was obvious. A girl with broken speech, no father, and eyes that looked too old for her age. They didn't see pain, they saw a target. I'll never forget the day, a boy whispered, "Your dad didn't want you." He said it with a smirk, casual cruelty dripping from his mouth. The words hit harder than any punch I would ever take in the cage. My fists clenched, my vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I would strike him right there. But I didn't. I swallowed the rage, carried it home, and let it burn inside me. That burn became fuel. On the mats, it turned into energy, into throws that grew sharper, faster, more violent. Every time I slammed an opponent, I imagined slamming that pain into the ground. It wasn't just practice, it was survival. My mother noticed. She didn't say it outright, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew I was fighting ghosts, not just opponents, and she let me. Because maybe she understood something I didn't yet, that the only way to carry grief is to turn it into strength. They thought pain would destroy me. But pain became the fire in my blood. Years passed, but the absence of my father never faded. Birthdays, competitions, small victories, each one carried a shadow. I used to imagine him in the crowd, cheering, his voice the loudest of all. But when I looked, there was only emptiness. That emptiness could have hollowed me out. But instead, it hardened me. I realized something in those years. Loss never truly disappears. It lingers, like a scar etched into your soul. But scars can be reminders not of weakness, but of survival. My scar reminded me every day that if I could live through that silence, through that absence, then I could live through anything. When I finally stepped deeper into the world of judo, when competitions became real and opponents more fierce, I carried my father with me. Not as a ghost haunting me, but as a promise. A promise that his death wouldn't be the end of our story. It would be the beginning of mine. The world saw a girl fighting for medals. I knew better. I was fighting for something heavier, for the right to say that loss would not define me, that silence would not chain me, that grief would not be my ending. They thought losing him ended me. But losing him was just the start of my war. They said a girl couldn't handle the discipline of warriors. They said a child without a voice, without a father, would never find her place. But my mother refused to let me drown in those whispers. She was no ordinary woman. She was a world champion in judo, the first American to ever hold that title. And she was about to raise me, not as a victim, but as a fighter. Discipline was her language. Every morning began before the sun rose, the house still dark, the air cold against my skin. She would wake me with no excuses, no softness, no room for weakness. On the mats, she'd say, her voice steady, her eyes sharp, and when I stood there, barefoot and tired, she didn't treat me like a fragile girl. She treated me like someone who had to survive. The first time she threw me, I hit the mat so hard that my lungs screamed for air. I thought she was cruel, maybe even heartless. But then she reached out her hand not to comfort me, but to pull me up so I could fall again. That was her way of teaching me. Life will throw you harder than I ever could, so learn to stand. Again and again. At school, I was still the quiet one, the girl they laughed at. But at home, on the mats, I was learning to become something different. Every throw taught me balance. Every grip taught me patience. Every fall taught me resilience. Pain became a teacher. Sweat became a friend. And my silence, once my curse, became my strength. They thought discipline would break me. But discipline was building my armor. My mother didn't just teach me how to fight. She taught me how to think. She showed me that judo wasn't just about strength, it was about control. Control over your opponent, control over the match, but most importantly, control over yourself. She told me that emotions could be weapons, but only if I mastered them. I remember one practice when I grew frustrated, tears stinging my eyes after a series of failed throws. I expected her to comfort me. Instead, she said, "If you cry, do it while you throw harder." Those words seared into me. They taught me that pain wasn't something to run from, it was something to carry with me, to turn into fuel. It wasn't just training, it was transformation. The girl who once cowered under the weight of whispers was beginning to stand taller, not because the world stopped mocking me, but because I stopped caring. On the mats, I was learning a truth most people never understand. Strength isn't loud, it doesn't need to shout. It exists in silence, waiting for the right moment to strike. The neighborhood kids didn't see it yet. To them, I was still the quiet girl, the broken one. But inside, something was changing. Each session with my mother forged me into steel. I was no longer running from grief, I was shaping it into a weapon. They thought I was just training, but I was preparing for war. Still, the path was brutal. My mother's lessons were not easy. Sometimes I hated her for it, when she pushed me past exhaustion, when she threw me harder than I thought I could take. When she refused to let me rest while my body screamed, those were the moments I questioned everything. But later, when I stood against opponents twice my size and dropped them with precision, I understood. She wasn't just teaching me judo, she was teaching me survival. She once told me, "The mat is the world. Ronda, if you can control what happens here, you can control anything out there." At the time, it felt like another one of her riddles. But as I grew older, I realized she was right. The mat taught me about life, that balance matters, that leverage can topple giants, and that every fall is just preparation for a stronger rise. The silence that had once imprisoned me now became my edge. I didn't waste time with words. I studied movements, read intentions, felt the rhythm of battle. I was quiet, but my silence was lethal. And so, while the world thought I was still broken, I was slowly becoming dangerous. My father's death had carved scars into me. My silence had shaped my eyes to see deeper. And my mother's discipline had armed me with the tools to fight. I wasn't whole yet, but I was no longer fragile. The day would come when the world would feel the weight of what my mother built in me. And when that day arrived, their laughter would turn to silence. They thought I was being raised. But I was being forged into something they could never stop. They said the Olympics were not for girls like me. They said I wasn't strong enough, fast enough, or disciplined enough to stand among the world's best. But those words didn't crush me, they carved me. And every time I heard them, I trained harder, until my sweat tasted like iron and my body trembled under the weight of ambition. The dream began with a whisper. Not from the world, but from inside me. The mats had become my sanctuary, the place where silence no longer felt like weakness. And as the years passed, whispers turned into fire. I wanted more than victories in dusty gyms. I wanted to prove, not just to others but to myself, that I belonged on the greatest stage of all, the Olympics. The road was brutal. Judo doesn't forgive laziness, and neither did my mother. Before school, after school, weekends, holidays, every day was a war against my own limits. My hands bled from gripping the GI. My shoulders screamed from throws, and my lungs burned as if they were collapsing. But with every bruise and every tear, I learned something no book could teach. Pain is the price of greatness. I was young, but I carried myself like someone twice my age. While other teenagers laughed with friends, I spent nights icing my joints, replaying drills in my mind, dreaming of the Olympic rings. I wasn't chasing glory, I was chasing survival, because deep down, I still heard the whispers of those who laughed at me. The echo of the boy who mocked my silence, the sting of the words that my father was gone. Competing wasn't about medals, it was about showing the world I wasn't broken. They thought my dream was impossible, but impossible was just fuel. The first international competitions felt like stepping into a storm. Opponents towered over me, their grips iron, their throws merciless. I lost matches that left me gasping for air, staring at the ceiling lights as if they were mocking me. But each loss was a teacher, each defeat a reminder that pain could be shaped into progress. I still remember one tournament in particular. I was thrown so hard that the mat shook under my body. The crowd gasped, the referee's hand shot up, and I walked off with my pride shredded. But in the locker room, staring at my bruises in the mirror, I told myself, this is not the end, this is the beginning. That fire carried me forward. I began to rise through the ranks, winning matches, earning respect, silencing critics. The Olympics were no longer a dream, they were a destination. And when I finally stood on the world stage, the air thick with tension, the flag of my country draped behind me, I knew every sacrifice had been worth it. The matches were battles, each one testing my will, my endurance, my very soul. And though I didn't claim the gold, I left with something that mattered just as much, a medal. Bronze, heavy in my hand, shining brighter than anything I had ever touched. When they placed it around my neck, I felt the weight of more than metal. I felt the weight of silence shattered, of grief carried, of every laugh I had endured, of every whisper that told me I couldn't. That medal wasn't proof of victory, it was proof of survival. They thought a medal was out of reach, but my hands were already built for holding weight. But here's the truth about dreams. Achieving them doesn't end the hunger. If anything, it feeds it. Standing there with the medal pressing against my chest, I should have felt complete. Instead, I felt something else, a restlessness, a whisper in my ear that said, this isn't enough. The world celebrated me, but inside, I wrestled with doubt. Was this the peak? Would I fade into memory as just another Olympian who almost made it? My father's absence still haunted me, my mother's eyes still demanded more, and my own heart refused to rest. So I left the podium, not with satisfaction, but with fire. I wanted more than recognition, I wanted to carve my name where no one could erase it. The Olympics gave me my first taste of the world's stage. But they also gave me the hunger to conquer something bigger. I had proven I could survive. Now I wanted to dominate. They thought bronze was enough. But bronze was only the spark of something far greater. They said the Olympics were the peak of my life. They said once the podium faded, I would fade with it. And for a while, they were right. Because after the cheers, after the medal, after the lights dimmed, I was left alone with something heavier than any assailants. When I stepped away from judo, I thought I was walking into a new life. What I found instead was darkness. No screaming crowds, no flags waving in my honor, no podiums or medals, just bills piling up, empty hours stretching into long nights, and the quiet ache of being forgotten. I worked jobs that stripped away my pride, waitressing in bars where men sneered at me, cleaning up tables while drunk voices mocked my name, as if I had never been anything more than a tired girl with a fake smile. Some nights, I would walk home with tips clutched in my fist, the smell of alcohol still clinging to my skin, and wonder if the world had been right all along. Maybe I was done. Maybe my story had ended with bronze. The weight of poverty presses harder than any opponent. It crawls under your skin, whispers into your ear, tells you you're worthless. I remember nights staring at empty cupboards, the hunger in my stomach mixing with the hunger in my soul. Every sacrifice, every bruise, every drop of sweat I had shed for judo. What did it matter now? The world had moved on. They thought I was just another forgotten athlete, but forgotten fire still burns. Still, there was one place where I felt alive: the gym. Even when I had nothing, even when my pockets were empty and my pride shattered, stepping onto the mats or lifting weights reminded me of who I was. My body remembered what my heart tried to forget: that I was built for more than survival. But life has a cruel way of testing you. I would train in the morning, then drag myself into the bar at night, wiping tables and swallowing humiliation. Drunk customers would sometimes recognize me. "Weren't you that fighter? The judo girl?" they'd ask, their words dripping with mockery. I'd force a smile, nod politely, and serve their drinks, all while something inside me screamed. The shame was sharp, but sharper still was the realization: no one was coming to save me. My father was gone. My mother had given me her strength, but this battle was mine alone. If I wanted more, I had to claw my way out of the darkness with my own hands. They thought the darkness would consume me. But darkness was teaching me how to fight blind. There was one night that changed everything. I had just finished a shift, my feet aching, my hands raw from scrubbing dishes. I stepped outside into the cold air, looked up at the sky, and whispered to myself, "This can't be it. This can't be all there is." That night, I walked past a dingy gym. Through the window, I saw fighters sparring, gloves cracking against pads, sweat flying under harsh fluorescent lights, and something in me stirred. I wasn't just watching, I was remembering. The rhythm of combat, the hunger in their movements, the fire in their eyes. It was a language I already knew, even if I had forgotten how to speak it. I pushed the door open. The smell of sweat and leather hit me, the sound of fists meeting flesh echoing in my chest. For a moment, I stood frozen, wondering if I belonged there. Then I remembered the bars, the mocking voices, the emptiness of my cupboards. I belonged anywhere but there. But I also belonged everywhere that required a fight. That night, I stepped into the cage for the first time. Not as a competitor, not yet, but as someone searching for a reason to keep breathing. I put on gloves that felt foreign and familiar all at once, and when the bell rang, when my fist connected, when the adrenaline surged through, I knew. The darkness had not ended me. It had only led me here. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. They thought I would stay in the shadows. But shadows only exist because of light waiting to break through. They said I didn't belong in the cage. They said judo was a sport of respect, but MMA was a bloodbath. They said I was too fragile, too feminine, too broken to survive in a place where fists, knees, and elbows wrote the rules. But when I looked at the cage for the first time, I didn't see danger, I saw home. The first time I stepped into a real MMA gym, I felt out of place. The smell of sweat was sharper, the sound of fists louder, the stares from fighters heavier than any throw I had endured. They sized me up, saw a girl with judo credentials but no striking, no cage experience, and they smirked. I knew those looks. I had seen them in classrooms, on playgrounds, in bars. Doubt was a language I understood fluently. But the mats don't lie, and neither does combat. The first time I grappled in the cage, I discovered something terrifying and beautiful. My body remembered how to fight. I might not have had crisp punches, but I had leverage. I had throws. I had arm bars sharp enough to slice through arrogance. And then came the night of my first amateur fight. The cage door slammed behind me, the roar of a small crowd echoing like thunder in my chest. Across from me stood a woman taller, stronger, and eager to rip me apart. The referee's hand dropped, the bell rang, and in that instant the world fell silent. Her fists came fast. A jab cracked against my jaw, a right hand cut my lip, and for a moment I staggered under the weight of her power. The crowd cheered, already tasting my defeat. But then instinct kicked in. I closed the distance, locked my arms, and with the same movements drilled 1,000 times by my mother, I threw her to the ground. The mat shook. My heart roared. I felt alive, and then came the moment that would define me forever. I trapped her arm, twisted, and locked the armbar. Her face twisted in panic, her body writhed, but my grip was steel. Within seconds, the tap echoed. The fight was over. I had found my weapon. They thought the cage would eat me alive, but the cage gave me my voice. From that night forward, everything changed. The whispers of doubt didn't disappear, they grew louder. Critics said I was a one-trick fighter, that my armbar was predictable, that real strikers would expose me. But with every fight, I proved them wrong. Again and again, I dragged opponents into my world, into the trap they thought they saw coming but couldn't escape. My armbars became faster, cleaner, merciless. I ended fights in seconds. I broke bones. I broke pride. I broke the illusion that women didn't belong in the cage. Every victory felt like justice, not just for me, but for every voice silenced, every girl laughed at, every woman told to stay in her place. Still, the cage was not kind. Training was a battlefield. My body carried bruises like armor. My joints screamed with every session. My face wore cuts like war paint. But I welcomed the pain, because pain was proof I was alive. Pain was proof I was building something that no one could take from me. One night, after another win by armbar, a reporter smirked and asked, "What happens when someone stops the armbar?" I looked straight into the camera and said, "Then they'll see the rest of me." Inside, I knew the truth. I was still building the rest of me. But I also knew that doubt was the air I breathed. And doubt had always been the fuel of my fire. They thought I was just a trick. But tricks don't break bones. As my record grew, so did the attention. Promoters started calling. The whispers of UFC echoed louder, though at the time women didn't even fight there. They said Dana White would never allow it. They said women's MMA was a joke. But every tap, every scream, every second victory forced them to look my way. I wasn't just fighting opponents, I was fighting history. I wasn't just chasing wins, I was tearing down walls built to keep me out. And I knew, deep inside, that this was only the beginning. The cage had called me, and I had answered. The world still laughed. The world still doubted. But now, I had a stage, a weapon, and a voice. And I would use all three until silence fell on everyone who said I couldn't. They thought the cage would bury me. But the cage was only the first step to the empire I was about to build. They said women would never fight in the UFC. They said the cage was too brutal, too dangerous, too sacred to share with us. Dana White himself once swore it would never happen. And yet, here I was, standing in front of cameras. My name being announced as the first woman signed to the UFC. It wasn't just a contract, it was a war declaration. I wasn't walking into the octagon just for myself. I was walking in for every girl who had been told she didn't belong. For every athlete mocked for her gender. For every woman who had been told stay in your place. The press conferences were a battlefield before the fights even began. Reporters smirked as they asked questions dripping with condescension. "Ronda, do you think anyone even wants to watch women fight?" I smiled, but inside I was fire. My answer wasn't words, it was the sound of my opponents tapping on the canvas. The night of my UFC debut, the arena was packed. Half the crowd came to see history. The other half came to see me fail. I could feel their eyes burning into me, waiting for the punch that would end my experiment. For the humiliation that would prove them right. The cage door closed. The lights blinded. My heart pounded louder than the crowd. Across from me stood Liz Carmouche, a warrior, fearless, ready to prove her own worth. The fight began, and within moments I was in danger. Her arm was locked around my neck. A choke that could have ended everything before it began. The crowd roared, smelling blood. I clawed at her grip, the edges of my vision darkening, my lungs screaming for air. And then instinct surged. I twisted, broke free, slammed her to the ground. The sound of her body hitting the mat was the sound of history bending. Seconds later, my armbar snapped into place, tight and merciless. She tapped. The fight was over. The UFC had its first women's champion. They thought the cage had no place for me. But I had already built my throne inside it. From that moment, everything shifted. The headlines that once mocked me now screamed my name. The UFC, once a fortress closed to women, now had a queen. And I wasn't just winning, I was dominating, one fight after another. Opponents fell in seconds, some tapping before the first minute, others writhing in pain as my armbars tore through their pride. But with every victory, the doubt didn't vanish, it multiplied. "She's unstoppable," some whispered. Others hissed, "It's all hype. Someone will crush her." I didn't care. Every voice of doubt was just another opponent waiting to be broken. I trained harder than ever. My body became a weapon honed to perfection. My mind became a fortress. When I walked into the cage, it wasn't just MIT, was every scar, every bruise, every humiliation I had ever endured walking with me. And my opponents could feel it. They weren't just fighting me. They were fighting my silence, my grief, my rage. The cage became my courtroom, and every fight was a trial. The verdict was always the same: guilty of underestimating me. They thought I was just a headline. But headlines fade, and legends remain. The walls were breaking, not just for me, but for every woman watching. Girls messaged me saying they finally believed they could fight. Mothers told me their daughters had posters of me on their walls. I wasn't just a fighter, I had become a symbol. And symbols carry weight. With each fight, the pressure grew heavier. I wasn't only defending a belt tie, was defending an idea, a revolution, a movement that could collapse if I failed. That pressure didn't scare me. It fed me. Because pressure is what creates diamonds, and I refused to be anything less. Still, I knew the storm was coming. Dominance never lasts forever. Empires rise, and empires fall. The louder the cheers grew, the sharper the knives of doubt became. They were waiting, watching, ready to see me fall. But I didn't care. Let them wait. Let them sharpen their words. I would keep breaking walls until there were none left standing. They thought I was just opening doors. But I was preparing to walk through fire they hadn't even imagined. They said I was unstoppable. They said I was untouchable. They said no woman alive could last more than a minute against me. And for a while, I started to believe it. The cage became my kingdom. Every time I stepped inside, the crowd roared like they were witnessing a storm they couldn't control. Reporters wrote headlines before the fights even began. Ronda wins again. Opponents walked toward me with fear etched in their faces, some broken before the first punch was even thrown. My weapon was simple, but it was merciless. The armbar. Over and over, like a signature carved into flesh and bone, I ended fights in seconds. 11 wins in a row, most in under a minute. The sound of a tap became the rhythm of my reign. But with dominance came something more dangerous than any opponent: myth. The world stopped seeing me as human. They painted me as invincible, unbreakable, a machine built only to win. Interviews called me a monster. Magazines called me the baddest woman on the planet. And part of me loved it. But another part of me felt the trap closing. Because myths don't bleed. Myths don't doubt. Myths don't wake up at 3 a.m. drenched in sweat, replaying every nightmare of failure. But I did. Behind the lights, behind the cameras, behind the unstoppable highlight reels. I was still human, still haunted by silence, by loss, by the girl everyone had once laughed at. They thought I was invincible. But invincible is the easiest lie to believe. I remember one fight in particular. The crowd hadn't even settled into their seats before it was over. 14 seconds. My opponent tapped, her scream echoing through the arena, and I stood there, arms raised, face fierce. The crowd exploded, but I barely heard them. 14 seconds. I had trained for months, sacrificed everything, for a fight that ended before I even broke a sweat. The glory was intoxicating, but it was hollow too. The faster I won, the louder the myth grew. Fans adored me, but secretly, I wondered if they adored the fighter or the story they had created around me. Was I a woman, or was I a spectacle? Every camera, every microphone, every headline built the legend higher, and with every step upward, the fall below grew steeper. The UFC built me into a face, a brand, a savior of the sport. I wasn't just a fighter, I was an empire in motion. Movies called me, sponsors lined up, fans screamed my name in airports. Fame became another cage, one without doors, where everyone watched, waiting for the moment I would crack. They thought my myth was power. But my myth was a trap. But still, I fought. Still, I crushed. Still, I collected armbars like trophies. Each opponent walked in with hope and walked out broken. And for a while, that was enough. The myth gave me power in the cage. My reputation beat fighters before I touched them. They saw me as a monster, and in their fear, they hesitated. In that hesitation, I found victory. But the more I leaned on the myth, the further I drifted from myself. Because myths don't cry. Myths don't hurt. Myths don't feel the weight of an entire sport on their shoulders. But I did. Late at night, after the lights dimmed and the crowd vanished, I would sit alone with my bruises and my thoughts. I would stare at my reflection and wonder, how long can this last? How long before the myth shatters? But I buried those doubts, buried them under training, under victories, under the roar of arenas. because if I showed weakness, the myth would die. And if the myth died, I feared I would die with it. They thought victory made me invincible, but victory was quietly sharpening the blade of defeat. Still, I rose. Still, I conquered. Still, I stood at the center of the storm, crowned as the queen of combat. To the world, I was a goddess. To myself, I was a woman holding her breath, waiting for the moment it all came crashing down. And that moment was coming faster than anyone could imagine. Because myths aren't built to last. Myths are built to fall, and when mine shattered, it wouldn't just break MIT, would break the world that believed in me. They thought my story was a legend, but legends are always one step away from tragedy. They said no one could touch me. They said I was untouchable, a storm that swallowed every opponent in seconds. But on that night, inside the octagon, I learned the cruelest truth of all: even storms can be silenced. The arena lights burned hotter than ever. The crowd was electric, every cheer vibrating in my chest. Across from me stood Holm, a boxer with clean strikes, calm eyes, and no fear in her face. Reporters had painted this as just another chapter in my invincible reign. The myth of Ronda Rousey would continue, they said. But myths always end. And mine ended with a single kick. The bell rang, and I surged forward, the way I always did, aggressive, relentless, hunting for the clinch, for the throw, for the armbar. But Holm didn't crumble. She circled, sharp and disciplined, her southpaw stance creating angles that sliced through my rhythm. I swung wild, desperate to impose my will, but every punch met air, every step met resistance. The crowd roared louder, sensing something they had never seen before. Me, struggling. Holm's left hand cracked across my face, then another. My head snapped back, the taste of iron flooding my mouth. I pressed forward anyway. Pride wouldn't let me step back, but pride is heavy, and that night, it dragged me down. They thought I was unbeatable, but unbeatable was already breaking. The second round began, and I could feel the weight in my legs, the fire in my lungs. I chased Holm, reckless, refusing to admit the truth. She was outboxing me, outthinking me, dismantling me, piece by piece. Every strike echoed in my skull, every miss tore away at my myth. Then it happened. I lunged forward, chin high, desperate for a clinch. Holm pivoted, her foot cutting through the air like a blade. The kick smashed into the side of my head, a crack of thunder inside the arena. My vision exploded into white, my body folded, and I collapsed onto the canvas. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no light, no crowd. Just silence. The same silence I had known as a child, the silence of being mocked, forgotten, broken, only now it was louder, crueler, broadcast to the world. The referee waved his arms. The fight was over. Holm raised her fists, the crowd erupted, and I lay there, my myth shattered in front of millions. They thought I was a goddess. But gods bleed too. The days that followed were worse than the fight itself. Headlines screamed my defeat. Clips of the knockout replayed endlessly, dissected, mocked, turned into memes. Fans who once worshipped me vanished overnight. Some laughed, others said I was exposed, that I had never been great at all. Walking through airports, I felt the stares. Strangers whispered, "That's the girl who got kicked." My name wasn't spoken with awe, anymore it was spoken with ridicule. I hid. For weeks, I couldn't face the world. The silence of my house was suffocating, the mirror unforgiving. I replayed the moment in my mind 1,000 times, the foot rising, the crack, the fall. Every night, I woke up sweating, hearing the roar of the crowd, seeing the look in Holm's eyes as she finished me. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was the doubt. For the first time, I questioned everything. Was I ever really great? Or had the world fooled itself into believing a myth too fragile to last? I thought about walking away. I thought about ending it all. Depression dug its claws into me, whispering that my story had ended, that there was nothing left to fight for. But somewhere deep inside, the same spark that had carried me through silence, through grief, through poverty, refused to die. I was broken. Yes, but broken doesn't mean finished. Broken is just another shape of strength waiting to be rebuilt. They thought the kick ended me. But endings can be deceiving. They thought silence would bury me. They thought after the kick, after the humiliation, I would vanish quietly into the shadows, never to be seen again. And for a while, they were right. The days after the fight felt like walking through fire barefoot. Everywhere I turned, screens replayed the same moment. My head snapping back, my body collapsing, Holm raising her arms in triumph, while I lay broken on the canvas. That clip became the world's favorite punchline. Late-night hosts laughed. Fans turned into critics. Strangers mocked me in airports. The champion they once worshipped had become a meme. I hid. My house became my cage. Curtains drawn, phone off, mirrors avoided. The silence I once learned to master now became my tormentor. I couldn't escape it. I'd wake at night, heart racing, hearing the phantom echo of the crowd cheering my fall. My body was bruised, but my soul was shattered. Depression doesn't come like a storm, it seeps in like water through cracks. One day you're breathing, the next you're drowning in thoughts that choke you. I stopped eating. I stopped training. I stopped being the weight of failure pressed down until I could barely stand. I had been the baddest woman on the planet, and now I was nothing. The media feasted on me. Headlines screamed my downfall. Exposed, overrated, never real. Analysts dissected every mistake, every flaw, as if I had never won, as if my entire legacy was just smoke and mirrors. And I listened. I let their words cut into me deeper than any punch or kick ever could. They thought my spirit was gone. But my spirit was learning how to bleed. One night, I sat in the dark with a bottle in my hand, and the thought that maybe the world would be better without me. Maybe the silence should swallow me for good. It was a dangerous thought, one that clawed at me more than once. The same way my father had fallen to his own demons, I felt mine tightening around my throat. But then, something small broke through. My dog nudged her nose against my hand, her eyes wide, demanding that I keep breathing. It wasn't redemption, not yet. But it was enough to pull me back from the edge. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting against the very silence that had stalked me since childhood. If I gave in, if I disappeared, then every person who said I was finished would be right, and I couldn't let them write my ending. So I tried to rebuild. Slowly, painfully, I walked back into the gym, but the air felt heavy, suffocating. The whispers followed me. She's done, she's broken, she's not the same. They weren't wrong. I wasn't the same. My confidence was gone. My aura shattered. But I trained anyway, even if every punch felt slower, every throw weaker. And then came Amanda Nunes. My second chance, my redemption or so I thought. But redemption doesn't come easy. The night I faced her, the lights were blinding, the arena packed, but I felt hollow. When the fight began, her fists tore through me like fire. Every strike rattled my skull. Every shot reminded me of the home fight. Less than a minute. That's all it took for her to dismantle me, to send me crashing into silence once more. The crowd cheered, but not for me. The headlines were merciless. This time, there were no excuses. No second chances. They said I was finished. For good, and I believed them. For months, I disappeared again. No cameras, no training, no future, just silence. I thought maybe my story had truly ended, that I had given the world everything I had, and now all that remained was the echo of my failures. But deep inside, there was still a flicker. A flicker that refused to die, no matter how heavy the silence pressed. I had been broken before. I had been mocked, doubted, discarded. And each time, I found a way to rise. Maybe this was no different. Maybe the silence wasn't my ending, it was my crucible. Because silence doesn't just bury. Silence can also transform. They thought I'd never rise again. But silence was already shaping my rebirth. They thought my story ended in silence. They thought I was finished, erased. Another fallen champion tossed aside by history. But deep inside me, a flame still burned. It was small, fragile, barely alive, but it refused to die. After the loss to Amanda Nunes, I vanished. I shut myself away from the world, drowning in shadows, suffocated by headlines declaring my end. Yet the longer I sat in the dark, the more restless that flame became. Pain had always been my companion. Doubt had always stalked me, and each time, I had risen. Why should this be different? One morning, I stood in front of the mirror for the first time in months. My face was different, older, harder, scarred by defeat. But in my eyes, I saw something familiar. It wasn't invincibility, it wasn't pride, it was defiance. I realized then, the world hadn't killed me, it had only forced me to change. I would never be the same fighter again. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe my story wasn't about staying the same, it was about transformation. They thought the flame was gone, but fire doesn't die that easy. When the call came from the WWE, I laughed. Wrestling. Entertainment. It seemed absurd, but then I thought about it. Why not? The cage had broken me, but maybe another stage could rebuild me. Maybe I didn't need to prove myself the same way anymore. Maybe I needed to prove that I could still stand, no matter where I stood. So I said yes. The first time I walked down that ramp, the crowd thundered louder than any MMA arena I had ever entered. Their cheers weren't for the myth. They weren't for invincibility. They were for me, the woman who refused to stay down. And as I stepped into the ring, I felt something I hadn't in years. Joy. It wasn't the same as fighting in the octagon. The WWE was spectacle, performance, theater. But it gave me something I desperately needed. A place to rise, a place to burn brighter again. Every move, every storyline, every roar from the crowd reminded me that my story wasn't over, it had simply changed chapters. And for the first time, I stopped running from my scars. I embraced them. They thought I couldn't stand again. But standing takes many forms. Of course, the critics followed. They said I was a sellout, that I had abandoned real fighting for scripted drama. But what they didn't understand was that this wasn't about proving anything to them. This was about survival. About finding a way to keep the flame alive. About refusing to let my defeats define me. Because the truth is, fighting had never just been about wins or losses. It had been about defiance. It had been about telling the world, you cannot silence me, no matter how hard you try. And that message didn't need a cage to echo. It only needed a stage. As the months passed, I felt the weight lifting. The depression loosened its grip. The crowd's energy filled the cracks that defeat had left inside me. And slowly, I began to believe again, not in the myth, but in myself. I wasn't invincible. I wasn't perfect, I wasn't unbreakable. But I was still here. And sometimes, survival is the greatest victory of all. They thought my scars made me weaker. But scars only prove you've survived the fire. Looking back, I realized the flame had always been there. Through silence, through grief, through poverty, through glory, through defeat, had never left me. It only flickered, waiting for me to see it. And once I did, it roared back to life. The cage had given me pain. The WWE gave me rebirth. But more than that, life had given me the lesson I needed. Greatness isn't about never falling. It's about refusing to stay down, no matter how many times the world buries you. And as I stood in front of thousands of fans, their voices crashing over me like a tidal wave, I smiled. Not because I was a champion again, but because I was alive. Because the flame hadn't died, and it never would. They thought I was finished. But the flame that wouldn't die was already lighting the way forward. They thought my story was only about the cage. They thought my worth was measured in belts, in seconds, in knockouts. But life had a different plan for me, because when the dust settled, when the cheers faded, when the lights dimmed, I discovered something bigger than titles. I discovered that I was more than a fighter. For years, I believed my identity lived in the octagon. Victory defined me. Defeat destroyed me. Every headline, every highlight, every chant from the crowd became fuel for my soul. But when I lost it all, when Holm's kick shattered my myth, when Nunes' fists buried my pride, I was forced to face the truth. I am not my victories. I am not my losses. I am the woman who rose in spite of both. I once thought being invincible was the goal. Now I know better. Invincibility is a lie. The real power is in vulnerability, in standing up after the world knocks you down, in daring to breathe when silence smothers you. They thought I was just a fighter. But fighting was only the mask. The flame that carried me through the WWE, through every reinvention, through every scar, taught me this. Life is not about proving others wrong. It's about proving to yourself that you can rise again. I began to meet young girls who told me they started judo because of me, mothers who said their daughters found courage watching me, even strangers who whispered that my story gave them strength to keep living. That was when it hit me. My greatest fight was never in the cage. It was outside of it, in the lives I touched, in the people I inspired by refusing to quit. Because that's the true karma of my story. The same world that laughed when I fell, that mocked when I cried, that buried me in silence, now had to watch me rise in ways they never imagined. They had to witness my scars becoming symbols, my defeats becoming lessons, my survival becoming my legacy. And that, more than any belt, is victory. They thought my story ended in failure. But failure was the seed of something eternal. Now, when I look back at the girl who couldn't speak, at the child who lost her father, at the waitress wiping tables with bruised hands, at the champion who fell under the weight of her own myth, I don't see weakness. I see chapters. Each one necessary. Each one carving me into who I am today. I don't need to be the baddest woman on the planet anymore. I don't need gold around my waist or headlines screaming my name. What I need, what I have, is peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you've walked through hell and kept walking. Some still whisper that my career ended in shame. I smile when I hear that. Because shame didn't end me. Silence didn't end me. Loss didn't end me. Nothing ended me. And nothing will. Because I am more than wins. More than losses. More than a fighter. They thought the end defined me. But the end was just another beginning. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: you don't have to be invincible. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to win every battle. All you have to do is rise one more time than you fall. That is strength. That is survival. That is victory. The world will doubt you. They will laugh at you. They will bury you in silence. Let them, because one day, when you rise from the ground, when you breathe fire through the scars they tried to shame you with, they will see what they never expected. You were never finished. You were never broken. You were never gone. You were just becoming. They thought I was defined by the cage. But I was always meant to be more. They said I'd given up after home. They said the silence would bury me. The losses would erase me. The world would forget me. But here I am, scarred, humbled, transformed, and still standing. My story was never about being invincible. It was about learning that true strength comes from falling, from breaking, from bleeding in front of millions. And still rising when no one believes you can. That's the lesson I leave with you. You don't need to be flawless to be powerful. You don't need to be perfect to be unforgettable. All you need is the courage to stand one more time than you fall. Because in the end, we are all fighters. Some battles are in cages, some are in silence, some are in our own minds. But each one matters, and each time you rise, you prove them wrong. If this story spoke to you, join me, hit subscribe, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling me which country and city you're watching from. Let's show the world how far a story of pain, survival, and rebirth can travel.